Philosophical suicide. The feeling of the absurd is not, for all that, the notion of the absurd. It lays the foundation for it, and that is all. It is not limited to that notion, except in the brief moment when it passes judgment on the universe. Subsequently, it has a chance of going further. It is alive, in other words. It must die, or else reverberate. So it is with the themes we have gathered together. But there again, what interests me is not words or minds, criticism of which would call for another form or another place, but the discovery of what their conclusions have in common. Never, perhaps, have minds been so different, and yet we recognize as identical the spiritual landscapes in which they get underway. Likewise, despite such dissimilar zones of knowledge, the cries that terminates their itinerary rings out in the same way. It is evident that the thinkers we have just recalled have a common climate. To say that that climate is deadly scarcely amounts to playing on words. Living under that stifling sky forces one to get away or to stay. The important thing is to find out how people get away in the first case and why people stay in the second case. This is how I define the problem of suicide and the possible interest in the conclusions of existential philosophy. But first, I want to detour from that direct path. Up to now, we have managed to circumscribe the absurd from the outside. One can, however, wonder how much is clear in that notion, and by direct analysis try to discover its meaning on the one hand, and on the other the consequences it involves. If I accuse an innocent man of a monstrous crime, if I tell a virtuous man that he has coveted his own sister, he will reply that this is absurd. His indignation has its comical aspect, but it has its fundamental reason. The virtuous man illustrates by that reply the definitive antinomy existing between the deed I am attributing to him and his lifelong principles. It's absurd means it's impossible, but also it's contradictory. If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. But it is so solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter, of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. Likewise, we shall deem a verdict absurd when we contrast it with the verdict the facts apparently dictated. And similarly, a demonstration by the absurd is achieved by comparing the consequences of such a reasoning with the logical reality one wants to set up. In all these cases, from the simplest to the most complex, the magnitude of the absurdity will be in direct ratio to the distance between the two terms of my comparison. There are absurd marriages, challenges, rancors, silences, wars, and even peace treaties. For each of them, the absurdity springs from a comparison. I am thus justified in saying that the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. In this particular case, and on the plane of intelligence, I can therefore say that the absurd is not in man, if such a metaphor could have a meaning, nor in the world, but in their presence together. If I wish to limit myself to facts, I know what man wants. I know what the world offers him, and now I can say that I also know what links them. I have no need to dig deeper. A single certainty is enough for the seeker. He simply has to derive all the consequences from it. The immediate consequence is also a rule of method. The odd trinity brought to light in this way is certainly not a startling discovery, but it resembles the data of experience in that it is both infinitely simple and infinitely complicated. Its first distinguishing feature in this regard is that it cannot be divided. To destroy one of its terms is to destroy the whole. There can be no absurd outside the human mind. Thus, like everything else, the absurd ends with death. But there can be no absurd outside this world either. And it is by this elementary criterion that I judge the notion of the absurd to be essential, and consider that it can stand as the first of my truths. The rule of method alluded to above appears here. If I judge that a thing is true, I must preserve it. If I attempt to solve a problem, at least I must not, by that very solution, conjure away one of the terms of the problem. For me, the sole datum is the absurd. The first, and after all, the only condition of my inquiry is to preserve the very thing that crushes me. Consequently, to respect what I consider essential in it. I have just defined it as a confrontation and an unceasing struggle. And carrying this absurd logic to its conclusion, I must admit that that struggle implies a total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with despair, a continual rejection, which must not be confused with renunciation, and a conscious dissatisfaction, which must not be compared to immature unrest. Everything that destroys, conjures away, or exercises these requirements, and to begin with consent which overthrows divorce, ruins the absurd, and devaluates the attitude that may then be proposed. The absurd has meaning only insofar as it is not agreed to. There exists an obvious fact that seems utterly moral, namely that a man is always a prey to his truths. Once he has admitted them, he cannot free himself from them. One has to pay something. A man who has become conscious of the absurd is forever bound to it. A man devoid of hope and conscious of being so has ceased to belong to the future. That is natural, but it is just as natural that he should strive to escape the universe of which he is the creator. All the foregoing has significance only on account of this paradox. Certain men, starting from a critique of rationalism, had admitted the absurd climate. Nothing is more instructive in this regard than to scrutinize the way in which they have elaborated their consequences. Now, to limit myself to existential philosophies, I see that all of them, without exception, suggest escape. Through an odd reasoning, starting out from the absurd over the ruins of reason, in a closed universe limited to the human, they deify what crushes them and find reason to hope in what impoverishes them. That forced hope is religious in all of them. It deserves attention. I shall merely analyze here as examples a few themes dear to Chestov and Kierkegaard. But Jaspers will provide us in caricatural form a typical example of this attitude. As a result, the rest will be clearer. He is left powerless to realize the transcendent, incapable of plumbing the depth of experience, and conscious of that universe upset by failure? Will he advance or at least draw the conclusions from that failure? He contributes nothing new. He has found nothing in experience but the confession of his own impotence, and no occasion to infer any satisfactory principle. Yet, without justification, as he says to himself, he suddenly asserts all at once the transcendent, the essence of experience, and the superhuman significance of life, when he writes, quote, "Does not the failure reveal, beyond any possible explanation and interpretation, not the absence but the existence of transcendence?" Unquote. That existence which suddenly and through a blind act of human confidence explains everything, he defines as, quote, "the unthinkable unity of the general and the particular." Unquote. Thus the absurd becomes God, in the broadest meaning of this word, and that inability to understand becomes the existence that illuminates everything. Nothing logically prepares this reasoning. I can call it a leap, and paradoxically can be understood Jasper's insistence, his infinite patience devoted to making the experience of the transcendent impossible to realize. For the more fleeting that approximation is, the more empty that definition proves to be, the more real that transcendent is to him. For the passion he devotes to asserting it is in direct proportion to the gap between his powers of explanation and the irrationality of the world and of experience. It thus appears that the more bitterly Jaspers destroys the reason's preconceptions, the more radically he will explain the world. That apostle of humiliated thought will find at the very end of humiliation the means of regenerating being to its very depth. Mystical thought has familiarized us with such devices. They are just as legitimate as any attitude of mind, but for the moment I am acting as if I took a certain problem seriously, without judging beforehand the general value of this attitude or its educative power. I mean simply to consider whether it answers the conditions I set myself, whether it is worthy of the conflict that concerns me. Thus I return to Chestov. A commentator relates a remark of his that deserves interest. Quote, "The only true solution," he says, "is precisely where human judgment sees no solution. Otherwise, what need would we have of God? We turn towards God only to obtain the impossible. As for the possible, men suffice." End quote. If there is a Chestovian philosophy, I can say that it is altogether summed up in this way. For when, at the conclusion of his passionate analyses, Chestov discovers the fundamental absurdity of all existence, he does not say, quote, "This is absurd," but rather, "This is God." We must rely on him even if he does not correspond to any of our rational categories. End quote. So that confusion may not be possible, the Russian philosopher even hints that this God is, perhaps, full of hatred and hateful, incomprehensible and contradictory. But the more hideous is his face, the more he asserts his power. His greatness is his incoherence. His proof is his inhumanity. One must spring into him and by this leap free oneself from rational illusions. Thus, for Chestov, acceptance of the absurd is contemporaneous with the absurd itself. Being aware of it amounts to accepting it, and the whole logical effort of his thought is to bring it out so that at the same time the tremendous hope it involves may burst forth. Let me repeat that this attitude is legitimate, but I am persisting here in considering a single problem and all its consequences. I do not have to examine the emotion of a thought or an act of faith. I have a whole lifetime to do that. I know that the rationalists find Chestov's attitude annoying, but I also feel that Chestov is right, rather than the rationalists, and I merely want to know if he remains faithful to the commandments of the absurd. Now, if it is admitted that the absurd is the contrary of hope, it is seen that existential thought for Chestov presupposes the absurd but proves it only to dispel it. Such subtlety of thought is a conjurer's emotional trick. When Chestov elsewhere sets his absurd in opposition to current morality and reason, he calls it truth and redemption. Hence, there is basically in that definition of the absurd an approbation that Chestov grants it. If it is admitted that all the power of that notion lies in the way it runs counter to our elementary hopes, if it is felt that to remain the absurd requires not to be consented to, then it can be clearly seen that it has lost its true aspect, its human and relative character, in order to enter an eternity that is both incomprehensible and satisfying. If there is an absurd, it is in man's universe. The moment the notion transforms itself into eternity's springboard, it ceases to be linked to human lucidity. The absurd is no longer that evidence that man ascertains without consenting to it. The struggle is eluded. Man integrates the absurd, and in that condition causes to disappear its essential character, which is opposition, laceration, and divorce. This leap is an escape. Chestov, who is fond of quoting Hamlet's remarks, quote, "The time is out of joint," unquote, writes it down with a sort of savage hope that seems to belong to him in particular. For it is not in this sense that Hamlet says it, or Shakespeare writes it. The intoxication of the irrational and the vocation of rapture turn a lucid mind away from the absurd. To Chestov, reason is useless, but there is something beyond reason. To an absurd mind, reason is useless and there is nothing beyond reason. This leap can at least enlighten us a little more as to the true nature of the absurd. We know that it is worthless except in an equilibrium, that it is above all in the comparison and not in the terms of that comparison. But it so happens that Chestov pulls all the emphasis on one of the terms and destroys the equilibrium. Our appetite for understanding, our nostalgia for the absolute are explicable only insofar precisely as we understand and explain many things. It is useless to negate the reason absolutely. It has its order in which it is efficacious. It is properly that of human experience. Whence we wanted to make everything clear. If we cannot do so, if the absurd is born on that occasion, it is born precisely at the very meeting point of that efficacious but limited reason with the ever-resurgent irrational. Now, when Chestov rises up against a Hegelian proposition such as, quote, "the motion of the solar system takes place in conformity with immutable laws, and those laws are its reason," end quote, when he devotes all his passion to upsetting Spinoza's rationalism, he concludes in effect in favor of the vanity of all reason. Whence, by a natural and illegitimate reversal, to the preeminence of the irrational. But the transition is not evident, for here may intervene the notion of limit and the notion of level. The laws of nature may be operative up to a certain limit, beyond which they turn up against themselves to give birth to the absurd. Or else they may justify themselves on the level of description without for that reason being true on the level of explanation. Everything is sacrificed here to the irrational, and the demand for clarity being conjured away. The absurd disappears with one of the terms of its comparison. The absurd man, on the other hand, does not undertake such a leveling process. He recognizes the struggle, does not absolutely scorn reason, and admits the irrational. Thus, he again embraces in a single glance all the data of experience, and he is little inclined to leap before knowing. He knows simply that in that alert awareness there is no further place for hope. What is perceptible in Leo Chestov will be perhaps even more so in Kierkegaard. To be sure, it is hard to outline clear propositions in so elusive a writer. But, despite apparently opposed writings, beyond the pseudonyms, the tricks and the smiles can be felt throughout that work, as it were, the presentiment, at the same time as the apprehension, of a truth which eventually bursts forth in the last works. Kierkegaard likewise takes the leap. His childhood having been so frightened by Christianity, he ultimately returns to its hardest aspect. For him, too, antinomy and paradox become criteria of the religious. Thus, the very thing that led to despair and the meaning and depth of this life now gives it its truth and its clarity. Christianity is the scandal, and what Kierkegaard calls for, quite plainly, is the third sacrifice required by Ignatius Loyola, the one in which God most rejoices, quote, the sacrifice of the intellect, unquote. This effect of the leap is odd, but must not surprise us any longer. He makes of the absurd the criterion of the other world, whereas it is simply a residue of the experience of this world. Quote, in his failure, Kierkegaard says, the believer finds his triumph. End quote. It is not for me to wonder to what stirring preaching this attitude is linked. I merely have to wonder if the spectacle of the absurd and its own character justifies it. On this point, I know that it is not so. Upon considering again the content of the absurd, one understands better the method that inspired Kierkegaard. Between the irrational of the world and the insurgent nostalgia of the absurd, he does not maintain the equilibrium. He does not respect the relationship that constitutes, properly speaking, the feeling of absurdity. Sure of being unable to escape the irrational, he wants at least to save himself from that desperate nostalgia that seems to him sterile and devoid of implication. But if he may be right on this point in his judgment, he could not be in his negation. If he substitutes for his cry of revolt a frantic adherence, at once he is led to blind himself to the absurd which hitherto enlightened him, and to deify the only certainty he henceforth possesses, the irrational. The important thing, as Abbé Galliani said to Madame d'Épinay, is not to be cured, but to live with one's ailments. Kierkegaard wants to be cured. To be cured is his frenzied wish, and it runs throughout his whole journal. The entire effort of his intelligence is to escape the antinomy of the human condition. And all the more desperate effort since he intermittently perceives its vanity when he speaks of himself, as if neither fear of God nor piety were capable of bringing him to peace. Thus it is that, through a strained subterfuge, He gives the irrational the appearance and God the attributes of the absurd. Unjust, incoherent, and incomprehensible. Intelligence alone in him strives to stifle the underlying demands of the human heart. Since nothing is proved, everything can be proved. Indeed, Kierkegaard himself shows us the path taken. I do not want to suggest anything here, but how can one fail to read in his works the signs of an almost intentional mutilation of the soul to balance the mutilation accepted in regard to the absurd? It is the leitmotif of the journal. Quote, "What I lacked was the animal which also belongs to human destiny, but give me a body then." Unquote. And further on, quote, "Oh, especially in my early youth, what should I not have given to be a man, even for 6 months? What I lack, basically, is a body and the physical conditions of existence." Unquote. Elsewhere, the same man nevertheless adopts the great cry of hope that has come down through so many centuries and quickened so many hearts, except that of the absurd man. Quote, "But for the Christian, death is certainly not the end of everything, and it implies infinitely more hope than life implies for us, even when that life is overflowing with health and vigor." End quote. Reconciliation through scandal is still reconciliation. It allows one, perhaps, as can be seen, to derive hope of its contrary, which is death. But even if fellow-feeling inclines one towards that attitude, still it must be said that excess justifies nothing. That transcends, as the saying goes, the human scale. Therefore, it must be superhuman. But this therefore is superfluous. There is no logical certainty here. There is no experimental probability either. All I can say is that, in fact, that transcends my scale. If I do not draw a negation from it, at least I do not want to found anything on the incomprehensible. I want to know whether I can live with what I know, and with that alone. I am told again that here the intelligence must sacrifice its pride and the reason bow down. But if I recognize the limits of the reason, I do not therefore negate it, recognizing its relative powers. I merely want to remain in this middle path where the intelligence can remain clear. If that is its pride, I see no sufficient reason for giving it up. Nothing more profound, for example, than Kierkegaard's view according to which despair is not a fact but a state, the very state of sin. For sin is what alienates from God. The absurd, which is the metaphysical state of the conscious man, does not lead to God. Perhaps this notion will become clearer if I risk this shocking statement. The absurd is sin without God. It is a matter of living in that state of the absurd. I know on what it is founded, this mind and this world straining against each other without being able to embrace each other. I ask for the rule of life of that state, and what I am offered neglects its basis, negates one of the terms of the painful opposition, demands of me a resignation. I ask what is involved in the condition I recognize as mine. I know it implies obscurity and ignorance, and I am assured that this ignorance explains everything, and that this darkness is my light. But there is no reply here to my intent, and this stirring lyricism cannot hide the paradox from me. One must therefore turn away. Kierkegaard may shout in warning, quote, "If a man had no eternal consciousness, if at the bottom of everything there were merely a wild, seething force producing everything, both large and trifling, in the storm of dark passions, If the bottomless void that nothing can fill underlay all things, what would life be but despair?" Unquote. This cry is not likely to stop the absurd man. Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. If in order to elude the anxious question, quote, "What would life be?" unquote, one must, like the donkey, feed on the roses of illusion, then the absurd mind, rather than resigning itself to falsehood, prefers to adopt fearlessly Kierkegaard's reply: despair. Everything considered, a determined soul will always manage. I am taking the liberty at this point of calling the existential attitude philosophical suicide. But this does not imply a judgment. It is a convenient way of indicating the movement by which a thought negates itself and tends to transcend itself in its very negation. For the existentials, negation is their God. To be precise, that God is maintained only through the negation of human reason. But like suicides, gods change with men. There are many ways of leaping, the essential being to leap. Those redeeming negations, those ultimate contradictions which negate the obstacle that has not yet been leapt over, may spring just as well, this is the paradox at which this reasoning aims, from a certain religious inspiration as from rational order. They always lay claim to the eternal, and it is solely in this that they take the leap. It must be repeated that the reasoning developed in this essay leaves out altogether the most widespread spiritual attitude to our enlightened age. The one based on the principle that all is reason, which aims to explain the world. It is natural to give a clear view of the world after accepting the idea that it must be clear. That is even legitimate, but does not concern the reasoning we are following out here. In fact, our aim is to shed light upon the step taken by the mind when, starting from a philosophy of the world's lack of meaning, it ends up by finding a meaning and depth in it. The most touching of those steps is religious, in essence. It becomes obvious in the theme of the irrational. But the most paradoxical and most significant is certainly the one that attributes rational reasons to a world it originally imagined as devoid of any guiding principle. It is impossible, in any case, to reach the consequences that concern us without having given an idea of this new attainment of the spirit of nostalgia. I shall examine merely the theme of the intention made fashionable by Husserl and the phenomenologists. I have already alluded to it. Originally, Husserl's method negates the classic procedure of the reason. Let me repeat, thinking is not unifying, or making the appearance familiar under the guise of a great principle. Thinking is learning all over again how to see, directing one's consciousness, making of every image a privileged place. In other words, phenomenology declines to explain the world. It wants to be merely a description of actual experiences. It confirms absurd thought in its initial assertion that there is no truth, but merely truths. From the evening breeze to this hand on my shoulder, everything has its truth. Consciousness illuminates it by paying attention to it. Consciousness does not form the object of its understanding. It merely focuses. It is the act of attention. And, to borrow a Bergsonian image, it resembles the projector that suddenly focuses on an image. The difference is that there is no scenario, but a successive and incoherent illustration. In that magic lantern, all the pictures are privileged. Consciousness suspends in experience the objects of its attention. Through its miracle, it isolates them. Henceforth, they are beyond all judgments. This is the intention that characterizes consciousness. But the word does not imply any idea of finality. It is taken in its sense of direction. Its only face value is topographical. At first sight, it certainly seems that in this way nothing contradicts the absurd spirit. That apparent modesty of thought that limits itself to describing what it declines to explain. That intentional discipline whence results, paradoxically, a profound enrichment of experience, and the rebirth of the world in its prolixity are absurd procedures. At least at first sight. For methods of thought, in this case as elsewhere, always assume two aspects, one psychological and the other metaphysical. Thereby they harbor two truths. If the theme of the intentional claims to illustrate merely a psychological attitude, by which reality is drained instead of being explained, nothing in fact separates it from the absurd spirit. It aims to enumerate what it cannot transcend. It affirms solely that without any unifying principle, thought can still take delight in describing and understanding every aspect of experience. The truth involved then for each of those aspects is psychological in nature. It simply testifies to the interest that reality can offer. It is a way of awaking a sleeping world and of making it vivid to the mind. But if one attempts to extend and give a rational basis to that notion of truth, if one claims to discover in this way the essence of each object of knowledge, one restores its depth to experience. For an absurd mind, that is incomprehensible. Now it is this wavering between modesty and assurance that is noticeable in the intentional attitude, and this shimmering of phenomenological thought will illustrate the absurd reasoning better than anything else. For Husserl speaks likewise of extra-temporal essences brought to light by the intention, and he sounds like Plato. All things are not explained by one thing, but by all things. I see no difference. To be sure, those ideas or those essences that consciousness effectuates at the end of every description are not yet to be considered perfect models. But it is asserted that they are directly present in each datum of perception. There is no longer a single idea explaining everything, but an infinite number of essences giving a meaning to an infinite number of objects. The world comes to a stop, but also lights up. Platonic realism becomes intuitive, but it is still realism. Kierkegaard was swallowed up in his God. Parmenides plunged thought into the One. But here thought hurls itself into an abstract polytheism. But this is not all. Hallucinations and fictions likewise belong to extra-temporal essences. In the new world of ideas, the species of centaur collaborates with the more modest species of metropolitan man. For the absurd man, there was a truth as well as a bitterness in that purely psychological opinion that all aspects of the world are privileged. To say that everything is privileged is tantamount to saying that everything is equivalent. But the metaphysical aspect of that truth is so far-reaching that through an elementary reaction he feels closer, perhaps, to Plato. He is taught, in fact, that every image presupposes an equally privileged essence. In this ideal world, without hierarchy, the formal army is composed solely of generals. To be sure, transcendency has been eliminated, but a sudden shift in thought brings back into the world a sort of fragmentary immanence which restores to the universe its depth. Am I to fear having carried too far a theme handled with greater circumspection by its creators? I read merely these assertions of Husserl, apparently paradoxical yet rigorously logical, if what precedes is accepted. Quote, "That which is true absolutely in itself. Truth is one, identical to itself, however different the creatures who perceive it, men, monsters, angels, or gods." End quote. Reason triumphs, and trumpets forth with that voice, I cannot deny. What can its assertions mean in that absurd world? The perception of an angel or a god has no meaning for me. That geometrical spot where divine reason ratifies mine will always be incomprehensible to me. There too I discern a leap, and though performed in the abstract, it nonetheless means for me forgetting just what I do not want to forget. When further on Husserl exclaims, quote, "If all masses subject to attraction were to disappear, the law of attraction would not be destroyed, but would simply remain without any possible application." Unquote. I know that I am faced with a metaphysic of consolation, and if I want to discover the point where thought leaves the path of evidence, I have only to reread the parallel reasoning that Husserl voices regarding the mind. Quote, "If we could contemplate clearly the exact laws of psychic processes, they would be seen to be likewise eternal and invariable, like the basic laws of theoretical natural science. Hence, they would be valid even if there were no psychic process." End quote. Even if the mind were not, its laws would be. I see then that of a psychological truth Husserl aims to make a rational rule. After having denied the integrating power of human reason, he leaps by this expedient to eternal reason. Husserl's theme of the concrete universe cannot then surprise me, if I am told that all essences are not formal, but that some are material, that the first are the object of logic, and the second of science. This is merely a question of definition. The abstract, I am told, indicates but a part without consistency in itself, a concrete universal. But the wavering already noted allows me to throw light on the confusion of these terms. For that may mean that the concrete object of my attention, this sky, the reflection of that water on this coat, alone preserves the prestige of the real that my interest isolates in the world. And I shall not deny it. But that may mean also that this coat itself is universal, has its particular and sufficient essence, belongs to the world of forms. I then realize that merely the order of the procession has been changed. This world has ceased to have its reflection in a higher universe, but the heaven of forms is figured in the host of images of this earth. This changes nothing for me. Rather than encountering here a taste for the concrete, the meaning of the human condition, I find an intellectualism sufficiently unbridled to generalize the concrete itself. It is futile to be amazed by the apparent paradox that leads thought to its own negation by the opposite paths of humiliated reason and triumphal reason. From the abstract God of Husserl to the dazzling God of Kierkegaard, the distance is not so great. Reason and the irrational lead to the same preaching, In truth, the way matters but little. The will to arrive suffices. The abstract philosopher and the religious philosopher start out from the same disorder and support each other in the same anxiety. But the essential is to explain. Nostalgia is stronger here than knowledge. It is significant that the thought of the epoch is at once one of the most deeply imbued with a philosophy of the non-significance of the world, and one of the most divided in its conclusions. It is constantly oscillating between extreme rationalization of reality, which tends to break up that thought into standard reasons, and its extreme irrationalization, which tends to deify it. But this divorce is only apparent. It is a matter of reconciliation, and in both cases the leap suffices. It is always wrongly thought that the notion of reason is a one-way notion. To tell the truth, however rigorous it may be in its ambition, this concept is nonetheless just as unstable as others. Reason bears a quite human aspect, but it also is able to turn towards the divine. Since Plotinus, who was the first to reconcile it with the eternal climate, it has learned to turn away from the most cherished of its principles, which is contradiction, in order to integrate into it the strangest, the quite magical one of participation. It is an instrument of thought, and not thought itself. Above all, a man's thought is his nostalgia. Just as reason was able to soothe the melancholy of Plotinus, it provides modern anguish the means of calming itself in the familiar setting of the eternal. The absurd mind has less luck. For it, the world is neither so rational nor so irrational. It is unreasonable, and only that. With Husserl, the reason eventually has no limits at all. The absurd, on the contrary, establishes its limits, since it is powerless to calm its anguish. Kierkegaard independently asserts that a single limit is enough to negate that anguish. But the absurd does not go so far. For it, that limit is directed solely at the reason's ambitions. The theme of the irrational, as it is conceived by the existentialists, is reason becoming confused and escaping by negating itself. The absurd is lucid reason, noting its limits. Only at the end of this difficult path does the absurd man recognize his true motives. Upon comparing his inner exigence in what is then offered him, he suddenly feels he is going to turn away. In the universe of Husserl, the world becomes clear, and that longing for familiarity that man's heart harbors becomes useless. In Kierkegaard's Apocalypse, that desire for clarity must be given up if it wants to be satisfied. Sin is not so much knowing, if it were everybody would be innocent, as wanting to know. Indeed, it is the only sin of which the absurd man can feel that it constitutes both his guilt and his innocence. He is offered a solution in which all the past contradictions have become merely polemical games. But this is not the way he experienced them. Their truth must be preserved, which consists in not being satisfied. He does not want preaching. My reasoning wants to be faithful to the evidence that aroused it. That evidence is the absurd. It is that divorce between the mind that desires and the world that disappoints. My nostalgia for unity, this fragmented universe, and the contradiction that binds them together. Kierkegaard suppresses my nostalgia, and Husserl gathers together that universe. That is not what I was expecting. It was a matter of living and thinking with those dislocations, of knowing whether one had to accept or refuse. There can be no question of masking the evidence, of suppressing the absurd by denying one of the terms of its equation. It is essential to know whether one can live with it or whether, on the other hand, logic demands one to die of it. I am not interested in philosophical suicide, but rather in plain suicide. I merely wish to purge it of its emotional content and know its logic and its integrity. Any other position implies for the absurd mind deceit and the mind's retreat before what the mind itself has brought to light. Husserl came to obey the desire to escape. Quote, "The inveterate habit of living and thinking in certain well-known and convenient conditions of existence." Unquote. But the final leap restores in him the eternal and its comfort. The leap does not represent an extreme danger, as Kierkegaard would like it to do. The danger, on the contrary, lies in the subtle instant that precedes the leap, being able to remain on that dizzying crest. That is integrity, and the rest is subterfuge. I know also that never has helplessness inspired such striking harmonies as those of Kierkegaard. But if helplessness has its place in the indifferent landscapes of history, it has none in a reasoning whose exigence is now known.